Thank you, Sarah. I've been asked to speak to you today about the history of the independent living movement here in this country, with specific focus on the early days of the independent living movement here in Ireland and the role which I play as a founder member of the Centre for Independent Living in this country. So to begin, I'd first like to speak briefly about what it was like for me to grow up with a disability before the whole concept of independent living reached our shores. I'd also like to touch on the impact of which independent living has made on my life, and to briefly summarise the philosophy of independent living, because I think the philosophy of independent living is sometimes lost along the way, and it's important that it's constantly being referred to ensure that it stays alive and well. So firstly, about me, originally I come from County Longford. I moved to Dublin when I was 3 years old, and obviously this wasn't by choice. This was back in the mid-1960s, when there were no support services available for people with disabilities, especially if you lived in rural Ireland. So I grew up in a residential school for children with disabilities on the north side of Dublin. Now, growing up in an institution wasn't always easy. The difficult part, one of the most difficult parts, was probably having to leave home after the various school holidays, which always felt like being torn away from your family. And it was also a very regimental place to live, with rules and regulations such as getting up, going to bed, meal times, recreation times, etc. So it wasn't easy to question or rebel against these rules, but this was known to happen. So at the age of 13, I was sent out to mainstream secondary school, and this was to have a major impact on the direction in which my life would take. Because up until then, the only contact that I would have had with non-disabled people was limited. And suddenly I found myself as the only disabled person in a classroom of about 30 pupils. So it was, needless to say, it was a bit of a culture shock. But I adapted quickly and found myself beginning to enjoy a newfound freedom of being able to live an ordinary life with similar opportunities to that of my non-disabled counterparts, which is an important aspect of the philosophy of independent living, having the opportunities and choices available to me and the same as my non-disabled counterparts. So the latter years of living in this institution were definitely made much easier for me by having the opportunity to head out daily to mainstream school. And this probably gave me a taste of the outside world, and probably sowed the seeds for me of the values of integration into society and the importance of being treated equally. So when I finished school at the age of 19, again I had to move to a different residential setting, and this time I moved to a Cheshire home in Dublin city centre, which was basically the best of a bad lot of options available to me. And again there were rules and regulations, but this time around the difference was that I was an adult. So I wasn't going to be told when I had to go to bed, when to get up, when I could see my family and friends, and so on. And this was the case when I first moved into this church or home. And it was a battle to change the system, which condoned such infringements of one's dignity and rights. So from day one, I obviously rebelled against such violations, and I have to say, with the encouragement of a fellow resident, and also who was a founder member of CIL, and her name was Ursula Hegarty. Now Ursula was a good friend of mine, and she had already been through the mill because she had moved into the Cheshire home a year before me, and she has basically warned me of what lay ahead of me. So basically we fought together to bring about changes, and you could say Ursula was really my mentor, my role model, and together we fought to fight for the various changes. And by rebelling against these changes, we set a precedent for other residents to follow suit and just to bring about change. And the period I'm referring to here now is in the maybe late 1970s or early 1980s. So this worked, and it made life somewhat easier for us. But again, I was still not satisfied, as it had never been my choice to live in an institution. And I vowed that someday I would move out. And I must also point out at this stage that my story is not unique, because many people with disabilities face similar battles and were forced to live in such restricted lifestyles at this time. So now I was probably heading towards my mid-20s. At this stage I realised that the possibility of being able to move away from residential settings might soon become a reality, when a group of people, 8 people with disabilities, myself included, we got together because we were dissatisfied with the way in which disabled people were being treated, and in which the way services were being run, and the way in which our lives were being controlled. So the first service we began to examine was housing, or rather the lack of accessible housing for people with disabilities in this country. And very quickly we realised that appropriate or accessible housing for people with disabilities would be pointless without the presence of a personal assistance service. And this was one of the first key factors which led to the establishment of the in-care programme, which was one of CIL's first undertakings. Now, the in-care programme examined, implemented and secured the provision of a personal assistance service in this country, and in turn this led to the establishment of the Centre for Independent Living in August 1992. So for the first few years since its conception, we at CIL focused primarily on introducing the whole idea of independent living and the possibility and the philosophy to the various stakeholders, and we pushed to educate on the differences between living independently and independent living. And the differences are huge, and I can just briefly say what they are. Briefly, the criteria for success for a person with a disability living independently is that you are expected to do everything for yourself without assistance. So for example, if this meant that it took you hours to get yourself dressed in the morning, but you physically were able to do it for yourself and by yourself, you are seen as being independent. And because you managed to do this for yourself without assistance, you'd be considered to be very independent and could live independently. Now this was the medical model way of thinking, whereas on the other hand, independent living was more about a state of mind, and it was about quality of life, and it was about quality of life with assistance. So it was not necessarily about physically being able to do things for yourself, but instead it focused on decision making and taking control of how things were done and by whom. So this was the social model way of thinking, and this is the way we wanted to go down, and the way we should live today. So as well as promoting independent living and the development of the PA service, the other main topic on the agenda at this time was to try and secure ongoing funding for the newly introduced personal assistance service. Funding had only been secured for a 2-year pilot project for 15 leaders. And after endless campaigning and fighting for this newfound freedom which we all had, the work was only beginning to ensure that this service remained intact and would grow and develop to beyond a pilot project status and to the service that we now have today as our personal assistance service. So for me to go into development of all the details at this point would take too long. But I certainly would. Yes. So I'll try and answer any questions afterwards if I can. So after my presentation. So just briefly, where am I today? Obviously, after all my involvement with the establishment of the CIL and the PA service, it was obviously no surprise that I was one of the first 15 leaders to receive my first personal assistant back in August of 1992. And for the first 6 years, I actually managed the service from within the walls of the Cheshire home where I still lived at that time. And this was my choice at the time. And it goes back to the whole idea of independent living being about a state of mind. Because obviously I had my personal assistance services now, but I still, and although I wanted to move from residential care, I said I was going to move when it suited me to move. So I was living independently. I had an independent living situation within the walls of a Cheshire home for about 6 years. I was able to get up when I wanted to go to bed, when I wanted to eat, when I wanted to go out, when I wanted to live my life as I chose. And then in 1998, I eventually did move from a Cheshire home into my apartment, and I now have a weekly allocation of 130 hours per week, and I've been managing my own personal assistant service since. So that's really all I have to say for the moment, and we haven't answered any questions. Thank you.